to this computer. Ta-da. Okay, we are recording. So let's get rolling. It's 8 o'clock, and I'd like to begin with discussion of lesson, it's 6, is it not? The notion, the idea of the mathematics. And let me bring that up. Yes. Whoop. No. Yes. No. Yeah, we're on lesson 6, mathematics as the language of process. That is odd. Let me there. Okay. And 6 itself is fairly straightforward. It's just the idea that math is the language of process. If you want to speak process, you got to speak math. Without that feeling for math, you can't really do anything in terms of processing. So I don't think that that's a difficult point for any of you guys to appreciate. But let's see. The next lesson, lesson 7, though, is where we really get into the guts of it. But there were some questions emailed in. Let me make sure I can address those. Oh, yes. You mentioned in lesson 6, most people are comfortable with Booleans, but not with algebra. And the point is that programmers seem to be able to use variables quite handily. What I'll point out is that programmers can do what I will call programming math, in the sense of using numeric values as counters, as pointers, as indices, and so forth. Using integer arithmetic comes easily to all programmers. The difficulty comes when we get into floating point and we're actually calculating things. And on that point, I think my impression is a lot of programmers balk at this. The discomfort is in translating real world issues into numeric values. For example, let's talk about Mary and John, and they have a relationship. How much does Mary like John? And what I say is, okay, let's put a number on that. 27 or 46 or 1.69 or whatever. That's the place where a lot of programmers have difficulty. The difficulty is twofold. First, there's just the idea of breaking a complex problem down into numeric floating point values. That is, we have a complex system here, and we're going to say, okay, here's how much she likes him, how much she trusts him, how significant he is that he gives her flowers, how much she is hurt when he doesn't notice that she changed her hair, whatever. Assigning numbers to all of these things, a lot of people have problems with that. And I think that this is an absolutely fundamental talent you are going to need. You're just going to have to get used to this idea. And one interesting thing I've noticed is that a lot of programmers who do manage to do some of this insist on using integers. I've seen a number of programs where they say, all right, this happens, so so-and-so gets one more good point. And so good equals good plus 1 or something like that. Very bad, very bad. Because an awful lot of changes, you want resolution in your calculations. In other words, you want to be able to differentiate between something that's little and something that's big. And if everything goes in steps of one, you have no resolution there. So you can't really precisely specify what you want to happen. Let's see, and I've forgotten the second problem that that programmers typically have with this. So, yeah, go ahead, Barry.
So with the thing having resolution with decimals instead of integers, couldn't you just make the integers really big? Like, giving flowers gives, like, instead of 0.1 and 1, just use 1 and 10. Like, what's the problem with that?
Well, you get more resolution that way. You could go up to 1,000 and get even more, or 1,000,000 and get even more. Or you could just go all the way to floating point and get the maximum. It's just, Klotzen nicht klachen, which is a German proverb, which means boot 'em, don't spatter 'em. Don't take halfway measures. If you're gonna make a decision and you decide this, then do it. There's really, I see no justification for using integers, except in those cases where integers are clearly called for. For example, if you're calculating something in an array, then that clearly calls for integers. Stepping through the array, you can't have, element number 5.6. It's either element 5 or element 6. But when we're talking about state variables, especially for relationships or personality issues, stuff like that, we're talking about floating point values. Let's see, Yvonne, linear versus exponential progression could help. I don't see a need for a differentiation between linear and exponential. Let's see, you mentioned that the distinction between when you should multiply versus add is whether a 0 in one category should drop the results to 0, which makes sense. However, there are other differences between multiplication and addition. For example, multiplying by a decimal will shrink a result, whereas adding a decimal will grow it. So what is one to do if they want the unique effects of multiplication without the multiply by 0 equals 0 case? Okay, yes, that's an interesting point. In multiplication, there's actually a, damn it, I've forgotten the mathematical term. There's, in addition, the number 0 is the balance point. That is, if you add anything greater than 0, you increase the value. If you add anything less than 0, you decrease the value. With multiplication, that balance point is 1. So if you multiply by more than 1, you increase it. If you multiply by less than 1, you decrease it. So long as you take that into account, there's no fundamental reason why you shouldn't use multiplication. I agree there are some tricky cases, some tricky considerations that go into this. And in fact, this is part of this idea of you need to have a feeling for algebra in order to use it effectively. And I'll be talking about this a great deal more. In fact, in my personality models, in my whole mathematical system that I use for interactive storytelling, I use values that are confined to the range -1 to +1. But then I use a different mathematical function I created called blend, and I don't really use math or addition. I'll explain that. This is a tricky subject, and I'll get into it. But using numbers from 0 to 1 does not make it hard to add or remove very subtle score. Like adding isn't too subtle in that. I mean, in the end of the day, it's very easy to translate it to a percentage, so I guess it's not that big of an issue. So using numbers from -1 to +1 is better than from 0 to 1. In general, yes, the advantage of -1 to +1 is that you get to have negative values. For example, let's just take a very simple value or concept. Is Darth Vader a good guy or a bad guy? Well, we could say 0 means he's very, very bad. But it's actually easier for many purposes to say -1 means he's very bad, +1 applies to a saint, and 0 is the average, everyday, typical person. Again, I'll be getting into this in a future lesson in some detail. Let's see. Let me go to any other lesson 6 questions. Just one question makes it. Are both variables necessary, or can either one alone? He's asking about, by the way, Paul isn't here. Odd.
No, I'm here.
I'm sorry? Oh, there you are. That's, oh, what's wrong here? Maybe, oh, okay. I had just sized my window in a way that cut you out. I didn't know Zoom does that. How rude. Let's see. To put it another way, if either one of the variables is 0, the result must therefore be 0. You must know. But if one or the other can do the job, then you add them. To put it even more simply, if you must have both one variable and the other, then multiply. If you can have either one variable or the other, then you add them. My thought is that it doesn't account for rate limiting factors or processes where one or the other input can be the bottleneck. It implies that more of one always means more of the output, even if you have a lot of that one. Actually, for that, you flip to the inverse operator, that is division versus subtraction. The more complex subject, though, of bottlenecks, that is a factor that is not, come on, what's the term? Can't recall it. If you want it to constrain, I'll be getting into this again. I'm worried that I'm getting into complexities that I'll be addressing later. So I'm going to dodge the question saying, we'll deal with that in a future lecture. Let's see, I'll go in. Here's an example. Imagine a machine that produces brass out of copper and zinc. It requires, oh, good, you know that brass is copper and zinc. It requires the two in a specific ratio. If you add more copper when you already have a lot of copper and only a little zinc, it will not increase the rate of brass. Yeah, that is not a simple, you can't do that with a single operator. We're talking about multiple operators here. And so it's messier than that. Let's see. So, okay, let's go to lesson 7 now. Now, lesson 7 is this is where we get into some really serious stuff. And by the way, I pulled a fast one on you guys. I had been writing all last week an addition to lesson 7, which I forgot to insert onto the website until last night. So there's now a lesson 7A stuck in there. I'll give you a quick summation of it. It is really just a whole bunch of examples. So it doesn't contain any new material. It's more additional examples of how this stuff works. But quick summary, lesson 7 is a very brief introduction to the concepts, the ways that I think about using math. The first idea being the analogy between, or the fact that multiplication and division are really just the multi-bit versions of what in 1-bit versions we call and or. Another way to say it is that and or are 1-bit versions of multiplication and division. So that's the first. That one's fairly easy. Let's see. Oh, the little bit about division. Division can always blow up in your face. So in general, sometimes you just add something to the divisor to make sure it'll never get down to 0. Let's see. It's always good to imagine a graph of the relationship you're imagining. So one of the first things I was taught in physics was, if you have any doubts about what's going on, draw a picture of it. And so when you're trying to figure out, what's the relationship here that I'm driving at, draw a quick graph. And then should it go straight up? Should it go flat? Should it curl up or curve down? Try to figure out that type of relationship, draw a picture, and from there you can proceed. If it's a straight line, you can use a linear equation. Y equals ax plus b. If it curves upward, then you can use an exponential. Y equals ax squared plus b, ax cubed plus b, and so forth. Ax cubed plus bx squared plus c. I have never needed to do that. But get an idea of what shape you want. No, I won't go into that. Square roots versus logs. Okay, and then the last section is really important. That's the how to create algorithms bit, which actually I'm rather pleased with. To quote myself, I would even go to say so far as to say that section is not a failure. So it's a good general system for creating algorithms. So when you're dealing with a problem, follow that system. You'll improve on it with experience, but this is a good way to get started. So let's see, a few questions here have popped up. D&D, good, neutral, chaotic. I'll get into that. Thomas Henschel of Archmaze Rice is a huge fan of yours. Suggested when randomizing traits for NPC to avoid too many extremes, a bell curve cheat is to generate 2 numbers, add and divide by 2. Concur. That's a very simple way to do that. There are many more algorithms, but yes, a bell curve is in fact the ideal. Unfortunately, again, my system with B numbers generates a pseudo bell curve. It's a bell curve with the ends clipped off, the way it works. And another way to describe it is that it maps the infinite number line into a number line running from -1 to +1. A side point on randomness. You don't need to use random numbers, or at least you will very, very seldom need to use random numbers. Random numbers are heavily used in game design, and a random number is an approximation of complexity. That is, in fact, I remember an argument 30 years ago with another fellow about weather and random numbers. And he was describing how he just used a random number system to generate the weather for his game. And I was pointing out, well, yeah, that's appropriate if you don't know what the weather is. However, that's only an expression of the fact that you don't know what the weather is. Theoretically, you could put a big weather simulator into your game and calculate all the things that would lead to various weather results and then plug all that in, and that would be better, I suppose. But the randomness is an approximation. You might even say a simulation of the complex system we call weather. And so random numbers are a quick and dirty way to slip complexity into your system when you don't want to actually generate the complexity. The thing is, with interactive storytelling, you've got far more complexity than you can ever cope with. You don't need to introduce any more complexity. You need simplification, if anything. And so there's simply no point in using random numbers. Yes, I suppose it's worthwhile to use random numbers for character generation if you want random characters. But, I mean, do you want a story world in which your player has no idea whatsoever of what the characters are like? You know, let's start our Star Wars game, and here walks in Darth Vader, and he's holding a flower, and he says, "I love the world. I love little puppies and lambs and flowers," and then Princess Leia walks in. "Anybody want to negotiate? I'll blast your fucking heads off." You know, well, that's could be the result of random number generation, but in fact, it's better if we already know who the characters are. So this is, I think, in fact, the central problem I faced with Cebu was the players had no idea who the characters were, and they couldn't get used to them. And I came up with a kind of solution for that with Le Mort d'Arthur, which is what permitted me to resume work on that. The basic issue, though, with the Arthurian legends is that people already know who King Arthur is, and they know who Lancelot is, and they know who Guinevere is, and they know that Mordred is the bad guy. These things are of enormous importance, and so you might want to base your first work on known characters, you know, steal some characters from someplace else. There are a million of these stories out there that you can steal. You know, you don't want to grab the latest characters from movies, but you know, there are lots of characters to grab from elsewhere, and the players will at least have an idea of who those characters are, so that can really help. So actually, it turns out a good, well, I won't get into probability distributions and Gaussians and binomials. Do you have any advice on how to develop a sense of what kind of curve a system should look like? That's what you bring to it as an artist. That is, you want to ask, here's a good example. You should be able to answer. I'm going to pose a question, and all of you should be able to answer it easily. Let's suppose that John is courting Mary. He wants Mary to be his girlfriend. So he brings flowers to Mary. And because he brings flowers to her, she likes him a little bit more. Okay? Now, suppose that he says, wow, that really worked. So he brings flowers to her a second time, and then a third time, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh, and an eighth, and a ninth. Make a graph in your mind of her on the vertical, or on the horizontal is how many flowers he brings to her, and on the vertical is how much more she likes him as a function of the number of flowers. Yep. It should be it should rise steeply at first and then rise, the slope should diminish. Because, you know, hey, the house is full of flowers. I don't need any more flowers. So you could do that. That's art. You know, that's how you do this.
But
Max, you have a question?
doesn't that depend on the character itself? Like if the character likes or not flower, or you know, this kind of stuff?
Okay, let's add that. Let's imagine that we want to throw in the fact that some people are really impressed by flowers and some people are not so impressed. How would you add that to the formula? Anybody?
Well, I would add a variable. Well, yeah. Mary likes flowers percentage.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's
you-
a number. Whatever, you know.
Whatever.
I think you would have to multiply by it in case somebody hates flowers and they have a 0.
Okay, actually, if they hate flowers, it'd be a negative number,
Oh,
the coefficient. So really to get a, here, I'll just type it in. Let's see. Come on, don't correct my spelling, damn you. So there's the first formula. The amount she likes him is equal to the square root of number of flowers, or the logarithm. You can do a bunch. If we want to take into account how much she likes him, then y equals or the likes flowers coefficient multiplied by the square root of number of flowers. So that's how we do that. This stuff really is easy. It's more just a shift in the way you think. But wait, we could get into interesting arguments here. For example, nobody really dislikes flowers, so should likes flowers run from 0 to 1 or from -1 to +1? Do we want to take into account the possibility that a person might hate flowers? Artistically, is that a reasonable consideration? Subjective. If one of you says no and the other says yes, you have no basis for contradicting the other person.
So do you think it would be interesting to have in a game, like for every character, a list of how much they like or dislike every verb, for example?
Exactly.
Like every kind of action?
Yes. Those are called character attributes or character traits. So you define a character. You say, all right, for this character, how much they like flowers equals 0.67. How hot-tempered they are equals 0.31. You have that set of definitions, and that's how you define a character. Barry.
this is sort of relevant to the question I emailed you. Do you mind if you go over that now?
Yeah, what was that?
The lesson 7. I emailed you 3 questions. One of them was for
Yeah.
lesson 7. Either I can read it or you can find it.
Yeah,
Either
why
way is
don't you, I'll just read it out. Near the end of the lesson, when discussing the question of which preconditions must be met for a character to take an action, it feels like we are finally getting into specifics of what it means to use the computer as a medium of artistic expression. Specifically, by choosing the conditions which lead to certain results, one expresses a perspective on the world. Yes. But if we are using the lens of conditions on which our game interacts with us and its algorithms function to glean meaning, it seems to me there's a certain terrifying medium is the message, incidentally, underlying any computer game, no matter how artistic, namely that the world is deterministic. Free will doesn't exist. And then you go on with all of these things. I would disagree here. Really, when you specify algorithms, when you say y equals the square root of the number of flowers, you're not in any way restricting the free will of the player. you're specifying the conditions under which the player must function.
But you're
So-
creating a world in which only the main character has free will.
No, well, yes, no. That is the non-player characters operate under algorithms, and if the algorithms are sufficiently complex, you can create the impression of free will.
Right. So that's the last paragraph is about, is that if you're watching a film or reading a novel, you just sort of think of what you're reading as like one iteration, and you can imagine the characters choosing something else. But if you play a game enough times, you run out of the possibility space, and like you were talking about before, it becomes clear, like you learn the algorithms.
Yep.
And it sort of starts, and like, is there a way around the creeping sense, like the creeping, terrifying sense that what you're playing is like it can't possibly be real because you're like the god of this world. You're the only one with free will.
Yeah, theoretically, there's a very easy solution to that issue. If you're writing algorithms that are artistically respectable, then your world is going to be complicated, and the player will definitely learn some things. He'll learn some basic rules. Golly gee, when I called that big hairy guy a jerk, he got mad and he hit me. Well, hey, yeah, you just learned something. So yeah, the whole idea of this is that as an artist, you're telling the player how the world works according to your perceptions. Now, if the only things you ever put in are things like, if you insult people, they get mad at you, well, you're not really saying anything worthwhile. But if you can start putting some subtleties into those expressions, then yes, the players are learning this stuff, but it's also, you're saying something reasonable. It's not like, or interesting, you're saying something interesting or worthwhile. It's not like a typical game where you learn that purple doors explode when you open them, but red doors don't. That's stupid. That's meaningless. And yet an awful lot of games, you spend all your time learning stupid, meaningless stuff like that. The whole value of interactive storytelling is that now you're talking about how real people work. And if you do it right, they can actually learn some interesting things. Lord knows, a lot of the guys who play these games really need to learn that if you say something stupid to a girl, she might get mad at you, because a lot of them don't even know that much. So, this is the whole point and purpose of what we're talking about. I will, and I'll also say, at some point in the far future, long after I'm dead, I think we will have to worry about a balance between how easy it is to learn the lessons and how much subtlety there is so that you learn deeper lessons. I mean, a great many stories turn on the complex factors that can cause a character to change. So, Barry?
So I definitely I definitely understand the idea that if you write an artistically interesting algorithm, a player learning it is learning something about your perspective on the actual world, or the actual world if you're really smart. But the thing that worries me, and this might not be a real concern, is that, like, so if you watch a movie where you see a character make a decision based on some information, you're like, oh, that character's mental processes worked like such, and you can imagine it applying to a real person. But you can also imagine that character making another decision. Whereas in a video game, to a certain extent, I mean, I guess if you made your thing infinitely complicated, this would be impossible. But like, to a certain extent, you're gonna know, like, that happened because of what I did. That happened because of a number that I changed. Like, you cannot, like, at least as far as I can guess, there's no world in which there's no world in which any character feels as real as the protagonist, because the protagonist is a real human being, like, interacting with this video game, whereas all the secondary characters are just algorithms. And
Well,
I don't know how. Oh,
well, remember that if your algorithms are any good, the player will discover that a certain character might react one way in one playing, and a very different way in another playing, because of what the player has previously done. In other words, characters respond based on history. And so the player can learn, if I've been this way and this way and this way, and I do this, then I get that result. Whereas if I do all of this other stuff beforehand and then do the same thing, I get a different reaction.
right, but the player knows that. Like,
Yeah.
they know that the computer character is not as real as they are, because whereas in another medium, all the characters are equivalently real. They're all one scripted event.
Yeah.
So how do you make a story where the other characters feel like they matter the way you do?
I don't see that as a serious problem right now. I agree that ultimately that will be a problem, but I see it as a matter of obtaining sufficient complexity. And right now we need simplicity. But as we build better character algorithms, I think we should be able to produce characters who behave in ways that are compelling. And remember, too, that we have that huge factor of interactivity that forgives a great many sins. So, yeah, there's an issue here. There are a million of these issues. But let me digress on a factor in what you were talking about, the idea that when you're watching a movie, you can anticipate alternative behaviors on the part of the characters. In fact, here's an interest. Did I already tell you about the point about mysteries generating multiple stories? Good. Mysteries are actually a fairly new genre of storytelling. They were really first developed by Edgar Allan Poe, or no, he just introduced them. And it was the Sherlock Holmes stories that really developed them. But even then, the Sherlock Holmes stories were really more expositions on obscure reasoning processes. Where it really got in, oh boy, I mean, there were a million of these mysteries, and the whole genre was developing. I think we can, although Agatha Christie didn't invent this, I think we can use her as a beautiful example of what mysteries developed into. She was one of the early practitioners of this. And this is the idea that a mystery stimulates the audience into generating a million stories. That is, until mysteries came along, every story just had the basic plot line. This is what happens. And then, or with a mystery, as you're getting information, it gives you a little bit of information, and you say, I think the butler did it. And so you're imagining this story where the butler sneaks in and hits the guy over the head and sneaks away. And then you're trying to explain it. Well, this is why the butler was, had to wash his hands and so forth. But then they mention another little fact, and you say, oh, butler couldn't have done it. Must have been the gardener. Yeah, because the gardener had did it. And you generate this other story. And then they give you another clue. And you say, no, it couldn't have been the gardener. It must have been the nephew. and you're generating all of these stories as you're watching the mystery. And so by the end of the mystery, you generated half a dozen stories in your head, all out of one story. So in effect, there's a multiplier effect where previous stories had just one story. With a mystery, you get 6 stories in one, 5 of which you generated all by yourself. Actually, it turns out there were 7 stories. The real answer that you didn't know because the detective says, oh yes, of course, beryllium, when heated above 112 degrees Fahrenheit, emits a toxic gas. Oh, well, I didn't know that. So that's how, that's one of the appeals of mysteries, that they are a way of getting the audience to generate gobs and gobs of stories, even though the author has to write only one. Of course, the author is actually thinking about all of those alternative stories. So in some sense, a mystery is, a half a step towards interactive storytelling, in that the author must anticipate what's going on inside the heads of the audience and manipulate that thinking process. With genuine interactive storytelling, you're doing the whole process. So I want to get to a question Paul emailed in this morning. It's about the Frodo ring equation. It isn't a question about the equation itself, just an observation. There's only one dramatically significant result that works with the story, that he destroys the ring. To me, this seems to show the limits of simulating storytelling, because the story has to end at that point. If he doesn't destroy the ring, the story would have gone on for maybe another 1,000 pages. It wouldn't have immediately ended the story in a bad ending, because there would be additional conflict, blah, 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 blah. So my thought is, why does it make sense to have alternative answers to that equation at all if the context calls for only one answer working in the story? I think with interactive storytelling, we'd need to be selective about which possible events can reasonably occur and keep them within the bounds of stories that work versus stories that are meaningless, blah, blah, blah. Why does the story have to have a happy ending? I mean, or here's another way. Let's talk about interactive writing, as in a text. And did my cat? No, he's still here. He didn't go onto your lap. Zoom has a cat transfer thing, Max. Let's see. Interactive writing, a word processor. Why does the letter you write on your word processor have to be the perfect letter? Is it the word processor's fault if you write a stupid letter? No. Interactivity permits you to do anything, including stupid things. You can write idiotic letters, essays that make no sense. You can draw pictures that aren't of anything at all. You can make music that is total crap. So why can't an interactive story world permit a very unsatisfying ending? Frodo says, "The ring is mine!" Ha ha ha! And what's his name? The Batman says, I'm sorry, the orderly. Who's the other character? The good guy character. Frodo's friend. Sam, yes. And Sam goes, "Oh no!" And and the music goes crash, boom, horror, dum, 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 dum. End of story. You can have that. So there, you can have lots of endings. With Le Morte d'Arthur, in fact, I enforce one of 3 endings. One of which is a happy ending. Arthur destroys Mordred. Another is a very unhappy ending. Mordred destroys Arthur, and then there's the intermediate ending where they both die. So there's, again, we don't have to enforce a satisfying resolution. Barry?
So like, if we were watching the movie though, and it had an unsatisfying ending, you would walk out and be like, "Oh, I learned nothing. That was pointless." So if you get an unsatisfying ending in the game, and not just satisfying in like the carnal, "Oh, that was cool" sense, but satisfying like the themes are tied up. Like now I understand what this story was getting at. You've just wasted your time. So I imagine you would want to make sure your possibility space doesn't allow for you to miss the point. Like the algorithms that generate the purpose of the story need to be like front and center, right? Like the ending should tell you something about the most important algorithms.
You're thinking in terms of a single instance. You can learn from failure as just as much as you learn from success. Indeed, a general rule is you always learn more from failure than from success. Right, so here's the dating simulation, and you say the wrong things and the girl says, "Go to hell," and you lose. Well, yeah, you can learn something from that, and you try again and again and again. That's how we play games.
Sure, but you wouldn't learn anything in the dating simulator if you tripped and fell on the sidewalk and died.
Yeah.
Like, so you do need to make sure to enforce that whatever your ending is has something to do with the message of the game, be that failure or success.
Oh yeah. And
like you don't want Frodo to like swallow the ring and then poop it out and be like, "Whoops," and that's the end of your story.
Yeah, sure. The issue, the problem in this particular case is that Frodo is a non-player character. So maybe you're playing as Sam and you're trying to influence him or something. And Frodo says, "The ring is mine." And Sam, you blew it. You didn't do whatever was necessary to get Frodo to do the right thing. So screw you. Try again. Game over. So that's how we handle that. Paul, was my answer to your question adequate?
Yeah, I thought it was good, and Barry's explanation was also what I was thinking. Like the Lord of the Rings story has certain themes about like power and how the hobbits desire power less than other species, so they were the most likely to give it up. So the possibility that Frodo could have kept it seems to go against the rest of the themes of the story. I thought like it seems to contradict the other algorithms in the story.
Yeah.
So it didn't seem like it would be a possibility that you should have accounted for it if you were writing a interactive story world based on it.
Yeah, well, in fact, that is because Lord of the Rings is a fixed story with a fixed plot. The whole idea is that in an interactive story world, you're not charging down one path. The whole point is that you want multiple paths because that's how you get free will, which means there really do need to be multiple possible conclusions. I want to make an important point. Damn it, there's my failing mind. There's a meme that computer people have been giggling about for the last 20 years or so. It's based on a concept from a mathematician about 200-300 years ago, the central point of which is that the negative aspect of things can be just as informative or useful as the positive aspect. Does anybody recognize what I'm talking about? It's associated with the guy's name. My way of expressing this is that the shadow paints the image just as clearly as the light does. That is, the negative is just as informative as the positive. Another way of saying this is that a sculptor, well, some sculptors create their works of art by building up. They add things to each other until they have their sculpture. Other sculptors make their work by taking away. They take a rock and subtract stuff until they end up with a statue. So is it the subtraction or the addition that creates the message? Well, it can be both. And in fact, in photography, especially black and white photography, what is dark is every bit as important as what is light. And in fact, when you watch cinema closely, you'll see that good cinematographers use darkness very carefully to help communicate through the image more powerfully. So failure is how we do that in games. Failure is the shadow. Success is the light. And so, yes, you want to, in fact, ideally, in terms of information theory, you get the maximum information theory when there are, or maximum information transfer when a 1 is just as probable as a 0. That is a stream of bits that's 1 1 1 1 1 1 0 1 1 1 1 1 1 0 and so forth. That really doesn't contain a lot of information. To maximize information content, you want just as many zeros as ones, and just as much negative as positive. And so for maximum information transfer, if you really want to say the most to your audience, you want to have them fail as often as they succeed. And they should be able to succeed in many, many different ways. Unfortunately, in most games, there's only one way to succeed. So they have lots and lots of failure until finally you succeed. And I would argue that the ideal is success, failure, success, failure, success, failure in random intervals. So anyway, let's see. Maybe have the player play as more than one character. Actually, there's another variation on that is that was cooked up more than 40 years ago by Jim Dunnigan. It was absolute genius, and that is you split the player. I'm sorry, the player. I'll just explain it. It was a game called Russian Civil War, a board game. And this was a civil war between the Reds and the Whites. The Reds were the communists, the Whites were the royalists who were trying to restore the Tsar. And at the beginning of the game, there are all these Red Army units and all of these White Army units. And basically, they are randomly, they're two actual human players. And the Red Army units and the White Army units are all mixed together and then split evenly between the two human players. And so each player gets some Red Army units and some White Army units. And the units are placed on the map they're in defined positions. And then they play a war game. Only each player is playing as both the Reds and the Whites. And the idea is that you can that you have your Red units attack his White units, and when you destroy one of his White units, you get to keep the little counter. You get to keep the body. And so as the game progresses, you build up bodies, piles of bodies. You have your bodies of dead Reds and dead Whites on your side. He has his piles of dead Reds and dead Whites. At the end of the game, one side wins. That is, either the Reds win or the Whites win, depending on how you played. When that happens, the player who has accumulated more bodies of the losing side wins the game. In other words, if the Reds win the battle, the war, then the guy who wins the game is the guy who has more White bodies in his pile. So you split your identity. Very clever. He did the same thing in a later game. That was actually a bit simpler. It was called Battle for Germany. It was about the end of World War II. And you had the Russians coming in from the east, attacking the German Eastern armies, and the Western Allies attacking from the west, attacking the Western German armies. And this player gets to control the Western armies and the Eastern German army. And this player gets to control the Russian armies and the Western German armies. And so you're both attacking and defending. And again, split personality. And it made for a very interesting game. I have never seen anybody in the, I've never seen a computer game that did anything like that. It's a brilliant idea. So keep that in mind. It might come in handy someday. Let's see. Creating complex algorithms to tell your view on the world seems harder than, say, writing a story to tell your... Yes, it's always tougher to specify algorithms than a story. Why? Because a story is an instance and an algorithm is a principle. That is, it's easy to say, you know, Darth Vader died in the end. And it is much more difficult to establish the principles under which evil behavior ultimately results in your demise. The general principle is always more difficult to specify than the single instance. Here's another example. I can toss the ball in the air and I can say, well, the ball was in the air for 0.75 seconds and it went up a total of about 40 centimeters. Okay, that's easy to do. But writing the equations that specify initial velocity, strength of gravity, velocity and position at each moment in time, that's a lot harder. But you see, the first statement only works for this one ball, whereas the second statement can send rockets into space or all sorts of other things. It's a lot more powerful and it's a lot harder. Welcome to the wonderful world of interactive storytelling. And another way to put it, by the way, there are a million written stories out there. If you want to write a story, you are in competition with millions of people through the entirety of human history. You know, you're up against Ernest Hemingway, Mark Twain, Thomas Mallory, William Shakespeare. You know, you're up against a big collection of people, and the odds of you're doing anything anywhere near as good as those people are just a smidge above zero. So why in the world do you want to go into that arena to engage in artistic combat? You're going to get slaughtered. Whereas if you go into interactive storytelling, I'm your only competition and I'm retired up from it. You got no competition. You can be the biggest fish in that pond like that. Doesn't that sound a lot easier? So ultimately, yes, in terms of actual labor, writing a story is easier. But in terms of competition, interactive storytelling is a lot easier. So, yeah, one of my adages or rules is the easiest way to be the biggest fish in the pond is to make your own pond. So, okay, let's see. Oh, wait, would you say that it is still possible to tell as subtle stuffs as a game designer than as a writer? Well, right now, no. Again, it is easier to do good work as a writer than as an interactive storyteller. That other job is easier. And because it's easier, everybody else is doing it. Here's another variation on that rule. If you stay on the freeway, you're only going to get to go where everybody else is going. Yeah, it's easy, but so what? If you want to get to the mountaintop, you're going to have to leave the freeway, get out of your car, and walk. And that's going to be a lot harder. But you're going to end up in a place where nobody else has ever been. So, let's see. That shadow reference reminds me another one. The more you want to shine, the darker the shadow you project, about duality. And yes. Okay, have I caught up? Well, this is lesson 8. We're not up to lesson 8 or lesson 9 yet. And it's 9:01. So let me just make a call for open questions here. Any last questions before we conclude?
Will we be able to get a link to this video too to share with others that are on our project team?
When we recorded I recorded the one on Wednesday, and the video was gigantic. 2 gigabytes or something like that. And I thought, geez, downloading that's going to be hard. So I just put up the audio for somebody to download. I don't know. What do you guys think? I don't think the video is of that much greater value than the audio. What do you guys think?
If you upload the 2 gigabyte video to YouTube, it'll compress it, and then when people watch it there, they wouldn't have to download the full 2 gigabytes. It'd just be a compressed version.
Gee, that never occurred to me. So obviously that was my idea, so that's why it's a good idea now. So, okay, yeah, I'll put it up on YouTube. Okay. Any other brilliant ideas that I didn't think of?
I do have another final question, if we can go to another one.
Sure, last question.
So I think the answer to this is probably yes, but do you think, so what we've been discussing is using like traits and like using algebra to make algorithms that describe human traits and make those human traits interact with each other. Do you think that's the only way to do video game storytelling? Like the only like worthwhile way that's not just a copy of movies and film, or are there other ways to interact with a story that don't require it to like be so open-ended and so variable? Like could you make something like is there another way to use the computer as a medium of artistic expression, or do you think this is the only form of interactive storytelling?
Well, certainly there are many ways to use the computer for artistic expression that are not storytelling. But if you want to do interactive storytelling, then it can't have plot. Here's the logical sequence I'm going to go through. It can't have a plot because a plot destroys interactivity. So it has to be character driven. That is, the interactions have to be with characters. Now, you can only interact with characters if the characters have some sort of personalities, and the behavior changes based on their personalities. So you're definitely going to need some sort of personality model, and you're definitely going to need algorithms for how their behavior is affected by your behavior. So I would say you need at least that much. Now, the thing is, the the Le Morte d'Arthur that I'm working on right now, the algorithms are actually pretty simple, and the character model is pretty simple. I think this is, I'm doing this to keep it simple enough that I think I can actually finish it and make it work as an entire system. With C-Boot, I aimed a little high, a good deal higher, and had a much more complex system. And the end result was something that was just unmanageable. We're not ready for C-Boot yet. But I think Le Morte d'Arthur will demonstrate a simple way of accomplishing this. We're going to have to accept the fact that
I didn't realize. Have you not? Is it not released yet?
No, I've released nothing.
Oh, I would. Do you have any idea when you will?
No, I'm not even promising that I will release it. I don't. See, with C-Boot, I got a bunch of people excited. I was excited about it, and people were contributing to the project. Some people were contributing money through Patreon. A lot of people contributed art and other things. And in the end, I had to kill the project, and I felt very guilty about wasting everybody else's time on a project that didn't work. So with Le Morte d'Arthur, I will talk about the fact that I'm working on it, but I'm making no promises. I'm making it very clear until I have convinced myself that this thing really will work. I'm not going to show anything to anybody. So, Max, you had a question?
Yeah. About what it asked before, like maybe there's a way to make storytelling as a game, but like a different way. But maybe it's if you don't interact with the characters themselves, but with something else. Like we can imagine a game where characters interact with each other, but you as a player, maybe you interact with the world they're a part of, or something else. Like you don't interact specifically with the NPCs, but with something different, maybe?
Well, I don't think there'd be any drama in that. I mean, yeah, that's certainly possible, but in some ways that reminds me of many of the existing games where you go out and shoot things and acquire things. And, oh, by the way, we're going to have these characters too. And I don't think those are accomplishing anything of significance. They're entertaining, but they're not art. So, yeah. And Leandro, you had a question too?
A quick one about the Le Morte d'Arthur. You were keeping the diary on your site, which I found very interesting. But
I'm not. That was for Le Morte d'Arthur up to a certain point. I stopped it.
Yeah.
And have not been. I still feel that I'm in an exploratory mode right now, and actually, there's not a great deal of design work. What I'm doing is writing all of the encounters, and I'm not even doing any algorithms for them. I'm just writing the text of the encounters, each one being, in effect, a short story. And I've got about 100 of them now, and I figure I'll need at least 200, maybe 300 before I've got something workable. So I want to get that entire set in place, and then I'm going to ask, do I think that this system can be made workable? And I just don't know. I'm just going to have to see. So, okay then. Now, what I'm going to do now is stop the recording and turn the meeting over. You want to handle it again, Paul?
I guess so. For last time, everyone left right after you left, so there was nothing to handle afterwards. So.
Oh, well, shall we just close the meeting now then? Or? Okay, we'll close the meeting now. So let me stop the recording.